St. Mary's General Hospital, known for its excellent medical care in a wealthy suburban area, was about to face an unforeseen challenge. Angela Parker, a skilled black nurse, had just joined the staff, unaware of the deep-rooted biases she would encounter. As tensions grew, a patient named Thomas Edwards silently observed from his hospital bed. But Mr. Edwards wasn't just any ordinary patient, and his presence would soon turn everything upside down. What secret power did this mysterious man possess, and how could Angela's struggles ignite change within the hospital? Let's explore the story further. But before we dive in, let me know where you're tuning in from today, and if you enjoy stories with unexpected twists and justice served, don't forget to subscribe. As Angela Parker walked into the spotless halls of St. Mary's General Hospital, the clean white floors shone under the bright fluorescent lights. The air smelled strongly of disinfectant, but there was something else in the atmosphere, a tension that made her stomach tighten. Despite feeling nervous, Angela straightened her back and lifted her chin, determined to make a good first impression. As she approached the nurses' station, Angela noticed an odd shift. Conversations that had been lively a moment ago dropped to whispers, and nurses avoided looking her way, their eyes darting nervously. She fought back the familiar feeling of being isolated and pushed down the wave of discomfort rising in her chest. "Excuse me," Angela said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse. Can you tell me where the head nurse's office is?" A blonde nurse with wide blue eyes looked up, startled for a moment, before giving a smile that seemed more forced than genuine. "Of course," she said in a polite but cool tone. "Down the hall, third door on the right." Angela gave a brief nod and started down the hallway, feeling the weight of eyes following her every step. The sound of her shoes clacking against the floor echoed loudly in the unnervingly quiet space, each click feeling more exaggerated than the last. As she neared the head nurse's office, a tall man in a white coat stepped out of a nearby room. He had salt and pepper hair and carried himself with the air of someone in charge, clearly a senior doctor. Angela's heart raced with hope. Perhaps this would be a chance to make a positive connection. "Good morning, doctor," Angela greeted him with a friendly smile. "I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse starting today." "It's a pleasure to meet you." The doctor, who introduced himself as Dr. William Gaves, gave her a quick once-over, his steel-gray eyes cold and unreadable. "I hope you've been properly introduced to our procedures," he said shortly. "We maintain high standards here at St. Mary's. I trust you'll be able to meet them." Without waiting for her response, Dr. Gaves walked past her, leaving Angela standing there with her hand still awkwardly extended for a handshake. She let it drop to her side, her spirits momentarily deflated. But she refused to let this dampen her resolve. After taking a deep breath, she squared her shoulders and knocked on the head nurse's door. As she waited, Angela's mind wandered back to her time in nursing school, remembering the advice her mother always gave her. "Baby girl," her mother used to say with pride and concern, "you're going to have to work twice as hard as everyone else. But never let them see you sweat. You come from strong women, and you've got that strength in you too." Those words fueled Angela through long nights of studying and extra hours in the lab. She remembered how some professors had dismissed her potential, how classmates whispered behind her back, questioning whether she belonged. Yet, despite everything, Angela had excelled, graduating at the top of her class. Her determination and skills silenced even her harshest critics. Now, standing in the hall of St. Mary's, those memories gave her the strength to keep going. She had faced challenges before, and she would rise to meet them again. The door opened, revealing a middle-aged woman with a stern expression. "Miss Parker, I presume?" she said in a clipped tone. "Come in. We have a lot to cover, and I expect you to keep up." As Angela followed the head nurse into the office, she couldn't shake the feeling that this job was going to be more than just another step in her career. The tension in the hospital felt thick, as if something was bubbling just beneath the surface of the professional smiles and calm efficiency. Little did Angela know, Her arrival would spark changes that would challenge the hospital's long-standing traditions and expose the hidden prejudices lurking behind its polished reputation. The rest of Angela's first day was a blur of paperwork, orientations, and quick introductions. As she moved through the hospital, she noticed subtle signs that she wasn't fully accepted. Conversations hushed as she approached, only to pick up again in low voices after she walked by. When she tried to engage in small talk, her fellow nurses responded with politeness but remained distant, leaving her feeling like an outsider in what should have been a supportive, collaborative environment. By the time her shift ended, Angela was mentally and emotionally drained. As she grabbed her things from her locker, she overheard two nurses talking quietly around the corner. "Did you see the new nurse?" one whispered. "Yeah," the other replied. "I don't know what they were thinking. This isn't exactly the neighborhood for, well, you know." Angela froze, her hand gripping her locker door. The sinking feeling in her gut confirmed what she feared. The cool reception hadn't just been first-day jitters. She was going to have to battle prejudice every day, whether she liked it or not. Leaving the hospital, Angela felt the weight of the day pressing heavily on her. She walked to the bus stop, her mind swirling with emotions. The excitement she had felt that morning was now clouded by doubt and isolation. Sitting on the hard bench at the stop, she pulled out her phone and dialed her mom. After a couple of rings, her mother's warm voice answered, "Hey, baby girl, how was your first day?" Hearing her mom's voice, Angela felt tears prick at her eyes. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "It was tough, Mama," she whispered. There was a brief silence before her mother spoke again, her voice filled with both love and strength. "Angela Marie Parker, you listen to me. You've worked too hard for this. Don't you let anyone make you feel small. You're there for yourself and for every little black girl dreaming of being in that hospital one day." Angela closed her eyes, letting her mother's words sink in. "I know, Mama," she said softly. "It's just harder than I thought." Her mother's voice remained steady. "Nothing worth having ever comes easy, baby. But you've got the strength of all those who came before you. Keep your head up, do your job better than anyone else, and never let them see you falter. Do you hear me?" "Yes, Mama," Angela replied, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "I hear you," Angela whispered as she ended the call. Just then, a sleek black Mercedes slowed down as it passed the bus stop. Through the tinted windows, Angela caught a glimpse of Dr. Greaves. His eyes met hers for a brief moment before the car sped away. Squaring her shoulders, Angela reminded herself of her mother's words. She knew this battle wouldn't be easy, but with the strength of her family behind her and her own unyielding determination, Angela was ready for whatever St. Mary's General Hospital threw her way. As the bus approached, she stood tall, ready to face another day. Little did she know, her presence at St. Mary's was about to set off a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of the hospital, exposing long-hidden prejudices and igniting change that was long overdue. The weeks that followed at St. Mary's were like a slow-burning fuse. Each day brought more tension to Angela's already challenging work life. The cold reception she had experienced on her first day had now evolved into something more insidious, a silent but clear form of exclusion. It was subtle, harder to point out, but impossible to ignore. During her morning rounds, Angela couldn't help but notice the stark difference in how she was treated compared to her white colleagues. Dr. William Greaves, in particular, seemed to take every opportunity to find fault with her work, no matter how diligently she carried out her duties. "Nurse Parker," Dr. Greaves called out one morning from across the bustling nurses' station. His voice was sharp, carrying easily over the noise. "I trust you've familiarized yourself with our protocols by now? We can't afford any mistakes." The way he emphasized the word mistakes sent a chill down Angela's spine. She met his gaze calmly, refusing to be intimidated. "Of course, Dr. Greaves. I assure you I'm well versed in all hospital procedures." Dr. Greaves raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "We'll see about that, won't we?" he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Let's hope you've learned everything you need to." The subtle insult wasn't lost on Angela, nor on the other nurses, who pretended to be busy but were clearly listening. As Dr. Greaves walked away, Angela could feel the weight of silent judgments surrounding her. Throughout the day, Angela found herself assigned the most difficult and undesirable tasks, while her white colleagues were given simpler cases. It became a pattern. Whenever there was a particularly challenging patient, it was Angela who got the call. "Angela, would you mind taking Mr. Johnson in room 305? One of the nurses asked, her tone sickeningly sweet. "He's been a bit difficult today." Angela nodded, knowing full well that difficult was an understatement. Mr. Johnson was notorious for his racist outbursts. He had already reduced 2 nurses to tears that week. But Angela approached the task with her usual professionalism, determined to prove herself. As she entered Mr. Johnson's room, bracing for the insults that were sure to come, Angela couldn't help but wonder if these assignments were designed to test her resolve, or worse, set her up to fail. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Johnson snarled the moment he saw her. "I told them I don't want no colored nurse touching me." Taking a deep breath, Angela steeled herself against his hateful words. "Mr. Johnson, I'm here to check your vitals and change your dressing. I assure you I'm more than qualified to provide your care." As she worked, Mr. Johnson hurled racial slurs and insults at her non-stop. Yet, Angela maintained her composure, completing her tasks with the same precision and care she gave to every patient, no matter how vile their behavior. When she finally left the room, she found Dr. Greaves waiting in the hallway, a fake look of concern plastered on his face. "Everything all right in there, Nurse Parker? We heard quite a bit of commotion." Angela met his gaze without flinching. "Mr. Johnson's vitals are stable, and his dressing has been changed. Is there anything else you need from me, Dr. Greaves?" For a brief second, surprise flickered across his face before he quickly masked it with his usual arrogance. "Well, let's hope you can maintain that level of composure with all your patients. We wouldn't want any complaints now, would we?" As Dr. Greaves walked away, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that she had just passed some kind of test, one that she should never have been subjected to in the first place. The rest of Angela's shift was a blur of endless tasks and subtle slights. She found herself double-checking her work, not because she doubted her skills, but because she knew that even the smallest mistake would be seized upon and blown out of proportion. Meanwhile, her white colleagues seemed to glide through their shifts effortlessly, chatting and laughing while Angela struggled under the weight of her disproportionate workload. The inequality was glaring, but each time Angela considered speaking up, her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Don't you dare let them see you falter." By the time her shift ended, Angela was physically and emotionally drained. As she packed up her things at her locker, she overheard 2 nurses nearby whispering. "Can you believe they're making such a big deal about these diversity hires?" one said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Yeah," the other replied. "It's not like they can keep up with the rest of us anyway." Angela's hand froze on her locker door. Her heart pounded in her chest as anger bubbled up inside her. She wanted to confront them, to defend herself, but she knew it would only fuel their prejudices. Instead, she closed her locker quietly and left the hospital, her head held high despite the weight of the day pressing down on her. At the bus stop, the same sleek black Mercedes she had seen before pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, revealing Dr. Greaves behind the wheel. "Nurse Parker," he called out, his voice laced with false concern. "Waiting for the bus again? Such a shame. Looks like that's all a nurse's salary can get you." Before Angela could respond, Dr. Greaves sped away, leaving her standing there, humiliated and seething. His casual cruelty cut deep, reminding her yet again of the uphill battle she faced every day at St. Mary's. As she boarded the bus, Angela's mind swirled with emotions. The excitement and hope she had felt on her first day seemed like a distant memory. Now, She was driven by a grim determination to survive in an environment that was anything but welcoming. But as the day's events played over in her mind, a small voice whispered that something had to give. Would she break under the constant pressure, or would her perseverance finally force a change in St. Mary's toxic culture? Unbeknownst to her, an unexpected ally was about to enter her life, someone who would help tip the scales in her favor and expose the deeply ingrained prejudices within St. Mary's General Hospital. As the bus rumbled through the dark streets, Angela closed her eyes, drawing strength from her mother's words and the legacy of resilience that flowed through her. Tomorrow would be another battle, but she was determined to face it head-on, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The next morning, Angela arrived at St. Mary's with renewed determination. She had spent the night reflecting on her experiences, reminding herself of why she had chosen nursing in the first place: to help people, regardless of their background or her own obstacles. As she made her way to the nurses' station, Angela noticed a flurry of activity. Nurses were hurrying to prepare a room, and there was a sense of anticipation in the air that she hadn't felt before. "What's going on?" Angela asked one of her colleagues, curious about the sudden commotion. The nurse, momentarily dropping her usual coldness toward Angela, replied excitedly, "We've got a VIP patient coming in. Some big shot had a skiing accident, broke both his arms, from what I heard." Before Angela could ask more, Dr. Greaves appeared, his face set in its usual stern expression. "Nurse Parker," he said in a clipped tone, "I need you to take care of the new patient in room 412, Mr. Thomas Edwards. He's had a severe skiing accident and both of his arms are broken. I expect you to provide him with the utmost care and attention." Angela nodded, recognizing the assignment for what it was, another test. "Of course, Dr. Greaves. I'll attend to him immediately." As she walked toward room 412, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about this assignment. The level of attention surrounding this patient felt unusual, and she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the situation than met the eye. When she entered the room, she was greeted by the sight of a middle-aged man lying in bed, both of his arms encased in casts. Despite his injuries, there was an undeniable aura of authority about him that Angela noticed immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Edwards," she said with a warm smile as she approached the bed. "I'm Nurse Angela Parker, and I'll be taking care of you during your stay." Mr. Edwards looked up at her, his eyes sharp and observant. "Good morning, Nurse Parker," he replied, his voice strong despite his condition. "I appreciate your help. I must say, I didn't expect to end up here after a skiing accident." As Angela checked his vitals and assessed his condition, she couldn't help but notice how closely Mr. Edwards watched her, as if studying her every move. Unlike other patients she had dealt with, there was no sign of prejudice in his gaze, just curiosity. "You seem quite competent, Nurse Parker," Mr. Edwards commented as she adjusted his fore. "How long have you been working at St. Mary's?" Angela paused, a little surprised by the genuine interest in his voice. "I've been here a few weeks now, sir," she replied carefully. "It's been an interesting experience so far." Mr. Edwards raised an eyebrow at her careful response. "I see," he said, with a hint of amusement. "And has the hospital lived up to its prestigious reputation?" Angela hesitated, unsure how to answer. Fortunately, she was saved by the arrival of Dr. Greaves, who entered the room with a level of cheerfulness Angela had never seen from him before. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Greaves exclaimed, his voice oozing with fake warmth. "I trust Nurse Parker has been taking excellent care of you. We only assign our very best staff to our most distinguished patients." Angela kept her face neutral, knowing full well that Dr. Greaves had never shown any such confidence in her abilities before. Mr. Edwards, however, seemed to notice the inconsistency. "Indeed, Dr. Greaves," Mr. Edwards said, his eyes flicking between the doctor and Angela. "Nurse Parker has been exemplary. In fact, I was just asking her about her experiences here at St. Mary's." Dr. Greaves' smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Well, I'm sure she'll tell you it's been nothing short of excellent," he said, his voice full of forced enthusiasm. "We pride ourselves on creating an inclusive and supportive environment here." Angela felt a surge of anger at the blatant hypocrisy, but she kept her professional demeanor intact. Mr. Edwards, however, didn't seem convinced by Dr. Greaves' response. "Is that so?" Mr. Edwards mused, his gaze still fixed on Angela. "Well, I look forward to experiencing this supportive environment firsthand." As Dr. Greaves launched into an overly detailed explanation of Mr. Edwards' treatment plan, Angela couldn't help but feel that something significant had just transpired. The way Mr. Edwards had looked at her, the pointed nature of his questions. It was as if he saw beyond the polished facade of St. Mary's. Over the next few days, Angela found herself spending more time in Mr. Edwards' room than with any other patient. Despite his injuries, he remained alert and engaging, often asking Angela questions about her work and her background. Unlike many of the other patients and staff, Mr. Edwards seemed genuinely interested in her responses, and never once did he display any prejudice or condescension. One afternoon, as Angela was changing Mr. Edwards' bandages, she overheard a conversation in the hallway that made her blood run cold. "I don't care what Dr. Greaves says," a nurse hissed. "I don't trust that Parker woman with our VIP patient. Who knows what she might do?" "I know," another voice agreed. "But we can't say anything. They'll just accuse us of being racist." Angela's hands trembled slightly as she finished her task, the weight of suspicion and mistrust pressing down on her. Mr. Edwards, ever perceptive, noticed her distress. "Is everything all right, Nurse Parker?" he asked, his voice gentle but probing. Angela forced a smile. "Of course, Mr. Edwards. Just focusing on getting these bandages just right." Mr. Edwards was silent for a moment, his sharp eyes studying her face. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've always believed that a person's true character is revealed not by how they treat their superiors, but by how they treat those they consider beneath them." Angela looked up, startled by the depth of his words. Mr. Edwards held her gaze, a knowing look in his eyes. "I've seen a lot from this hospital bed, Nurse Parker, and I can tell you, the view has been enlightening." Before Angela could respond, Dr. Greaves entered the room, cutting their conversation short. As she left, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Edwards was more than just another VIP patient. His words and actions suggested that he understood the deeper dynamics at play within St. Mary's. For the first time since she had started working there, Angela felt a glimmer of hope. Little did she know, Mr. Edwards' presence would soon set off a series of events that would shake St. Mary's to its core, exposing the deep-seated prejudices that had long festered beneath its pristine surface. As the days wore on, Angela found herself more isolated than ever at St. Mary's. The initial coldness from her colleagues had evolved into outright hostility. Whispered comments and pointed stares followed her everywhere she went. Dr. Greaves, emboldened by the lack of consequences for his behavior, became even more blatant in his attempts to undermine her. One morning, as Angela reviewed patient charts at the nurses' station, Dr. Greaves approached her with a stack of files. "Nurse Parker," he said, his voice dripping with false concern, "I need you to handle these cases today. They're particularly challenging." "I trust you're up to the task," Dr. Greaves said, placing a hefty stack of files on the desk in front of Angela. It was nearly double the workload compared to her colleagues, and the intent behind it was clear. Angela glanced at the pile, then met Dr. Greaves' gaze, determined not to show any sign of intimidation. "Of course, Dr. Greaves," she replied with steady composure. "I'll take care of it right away." As he walked away, Angela could hear him mutter under his breath, "Let's see how she handles this." A smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth. Throughout the day, Angela found herself running from one demanding case to another, barely catching her breath. The patients assigned to her had some of the most complex medical needs and difficult personalities in the hospital. Even though she was exhausted, Angela refused to let her standards slip. She treated every patient with professionalism and care, determined not to give her detractors the satisfaction of seeing her fail. But the relentless pressure was starting to take its toll. Her body ached from the constant movement, and mentally, she was drained. As she rushed to respond to yet another patient call, Angela overheard two nurses whispering near the station. "Can you believe they're making her handle all the critical cases?" one nurse said, her voice dripping with disdain. "It's like they're waiting for her to mess up," the other replied. "Yeah, but honestly, it's impressive how she keeps going. I would have cracked by now." Hearing that made Angela's heart ache. It wasn't just the unfair treatment, it was the fact that her colleagues were watching, almost hoping she would stumble. The weight of it all was nearly unbearable. By the time she finished her rounds, Angela found herself returning to Mr. Edwards' room more often. It had become a rare sanctuary for her, a place where she could momentarily feel seen and valued. Mr. Edwards always greeted her with warmth and understanding, his quiet presence a balm for her weary soul. "Nurse Parker," he said with his usual calm as she entered his room for a routine checkup, "you look exhausted. Is everything all right?" Angela forced a small smile. "Just a busy day, Mr. Edwards. Nothing I can't handle." He studied her carefully, his sharp eyes filled with concern. "You know," he began thoughtfully, "there's a difference between handling something and thriving. From what I've seen, you're more than capable of the latter." His words were kind, but they only underscored the contrast between how Mr. Edwards treated her and the way the rest of the hospital staff viewed her. A lump formed in Angela's throat as the weight of her isolation threatened to overwhelm her. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," she managed to say, her voice soft. "I appreciate your kindness." As she turned to leave, Mr. Edwards called out to her, his voice calm yet firm. "Nurse Parker," he said, making her pause, "remember, sometimes the greatest strength lies in knowing when to speak up." His words echoed in Angela's mind as she walked back to the nurses' station, unable to shake the feeling that something was about to change. Little did she know, the next day would bring a series of events that would push her to her limits and force a confrontation that had been building since her first day at St. Mary's. The following morning, Angela arrived at the hospital to find it buzzing with nervous energy. Rumors were flying about a high-stakes emergency operation scheduled for later in the day. Important visitors, including hospital board members, were expected to observe the procedure. As Angela began her rounds, she noticed the tension in the air. Nurses and doctors were on edge, the pressure of the upcoming operation looming over everything. Midway through her duties, Dr. Greaves approached Angela, a gleam in his eye that instantly set her on guard. "Nurse Parker," he said in a deceptively neutral tone, "we need you to assist with the emergency operation this afternoon. It's a critical case. I trust you're prepared to handle it." Angela felt a mix of surprise and suspicion. Being asked to assist in such a high-profile surgery was typically an honor. But coming from Dr. Greaves, it felt like another test, another trap. "Of course, Dr. Greaves," she replied, keeping her voice level. "I'll be ready." As Dr. Greaves walked away, Angela overheard him muttering to a fellow doctor, "Let's see how she handles the pressure. This should be interesting." The hours leading up to the operation flew by in a blur of preparation. Angela doubled and triple-checked everything, determined to be as ready as possible. She knew the operation was important, not just for the patient but for her reputation as well. When the time came to scrub in, Angela couldn't ignore the skeptical glances from some of the other staff members. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, "Don't you dare let them see you falter." The operation began, and Angela found herself working alongside Dr. Greaves and several other senior surgeons. The atmosphere in the room was tense, the knowledge that high-ranking observers were watching every move adding a layer of pressure. Despite the intensity of the situation, Angela remained focused. Her movements were precise, and she anticipated the surgeons' needs, handing them instruments before they had to ask. Her training and experience shone through, and for a brief moment it seemed like everything was going smoothly. But then, Angela noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. Dr. Greaves, usually so confident and sure, hesitated. His hands trembled slightly as he prepared to make a crucial incision. In that split second, Angela realized he was about to make a potentially life-threatening mistake. Without hesitation, she spoke up. "Dr. Greaves," she said, her voice clear and firm, "perhaps we should consider approaching from a different angle. The patient's anatomy suggests—" Dr. Greaves cut her off, his tone sharp. "I've done this procedure 100 times, Nurse Parker. Stay in your lane." Angela's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. "With respect, doctor, the scans show that this approach could damage a vital artery. I believe we should reassess." For a moment, the room was deathly silent. The tension was palpable as Dr. Greaves glared at Angela, his ego clearly bruised. But after a long pause, one of the senior surgeons, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Nurse Parker is right," he said. "We should reassess." Dr. Greaves clenched his jaw but nodded stiffly, stepping aside to let the senior surgeon take over. As the operation proceeded, it became clear that Angela's suggestion had likely saved the patient's life. After the surgery, as Angela removed her gloves and prepared to leave, she caught Dr. Greaves watching her, his expression unreadable. She knew the confrontation wasn't over. But for now, she had passed the test. And for the first time since starting at St. Mary's, Angela felt the stirrings of change, both in herself and in the hospital around her. "It might be safer," Angela had said, and the room fell silent. All eyes turned toward her, and Dr. Greaves looked at her, a mixture of surprise and anger flashing across his face. For a moment, Angela thought he might dismiss her suggestion outright, but after a tense pause, Dr. Greaves gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He adjusted his approach, following Angela's suggestion. As the operation continued, it became clear that her intervention had likely saved the patient's life. Once the surgery concluded successfully, Angela could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her. Some of the medical staff looked at her with newfound respect, while others, particularly Dr. Greaves, seemed to be barely holding back their fury. As the team began to clean up, Dr. Greaves turned to Angela, his voice low and filled with menace. "Nurse Parker, I need to see you in private. Now." Angela followed Dr. Greaves out of the operating room, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had done the right thing by speaking up, but it felt like she was walking into a storm that might cost her everything. To her surprise, they entered Mr. Edwards' room. In the chaos of the surgery, Angela had almost forgotten that he was still a patient in the hospital. Dr. Greaves, too consumed by his anger, didn't seem to realize or care about where they were. The moment the door closed behind them, he spun around, his face red with fury. "How dare you question my judgment in there?" he hissed, venom dripping from every word. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? You're lucky I don't have you fired on the spot for such insubordination." Angela remained calm, her voice steady. "Dr. Greaves, I was doing my job. The patient's safety." "Your job," Dr. Greaves interrupted, his voice rising. "Your job is to follow orders, not to think you know better than your superiors. This is why people like you don't belong in prestigious institutions like St. Mary's. You're only here because of some misguided attempt at diversity, not because you have any real skill or knowledge." As Dr. Greaves' tirade grew more overtly hostile and racist, Angela felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over her. All the microaggressions and slights she had endured since her first day seemed to pale in comparison to this outright attack. Just as Angela was about to respond, a voice cut through the room. It was firm, calm, and full of authority. "Dr. Greaves," Mr. Edwards said, his voice sharp enough to stop the tirade in its tracks, "I believe you've forgotten where you are and who you're speaking to." Both Angela and Dr. Greaves turned, startled to see Mr. Edwards sitting up in his bed, his expression controlled but filled with anger. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Greaves stammered, his face turning pale as the gravity of his mistake hit him. I didn't realize you were awake. I apologize for disturbing you." "Oh, I'm very much awake, Dr. Greaves," Mr. Edwards replied, his eyes narrowing. "And I've been awake long enough to observe the disgraceful way you and others in this hospital have treated Nurse Parker." Angela stood frozen, unable to believe what she was hearing. The quiet, unassuming patient in the hospital bed was suddenly commanding the room with an aura of authority she hadn't seen before. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Greaves began, his voice trembling, "I assure you there's been a misunderstanding." "There's been no misunderstanding," Mr. Edwards cut him off sharply. "What I've witnessed here is a clear pattern of discrimination and harassment, and it ends now." The weight of his words hit both Angela and Dr. Greaves like a shock wave. It became clear that Mr. Edwards was far more than just a VIP patient. The authority in his voice and the way he carried himself indicated he held significant power. Who are you?" Dr. Greaves asked, his earlier bravado completely gone. Mr. Edwards smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm someone who has the power to make or break this hospital's future. And right now, Dr. Greaves, I'm not feeling very inclined to support an institution that allows such blatant racism and unprofessional behavior." As the reality of the situation sank in, Angela felt a mix of emotions: relief that someone had finally acknowledged the treatment she had endured, anger at the injustice, and a spark of hope that things might finally change. The tension in the room was thick as Dr. Greaves struggled to compose himself. His face ashen, he muttered, We'll continue this discussion later, Mr. Edwards. Nurse Parker, you're dismissed for now." Dr. Greaves hurried out of the room, and Angela found herself alone with Mr. Edwards. The silence between them was heavy, loaded with unspoken thoughts. "Nurse Parker," Mr. Edwards said at last, his voice much gentler now, "I think it's time I properly introduced myself. My name is Thomas Edwards, and I'm the CEO of Healthcare United, one of the largest healthcare conglomerates in the country." Angela's eyes widened in shock. Healthcare United was a giant in the medical world, known for its vast influence and resources. Suddenly, everything Mr. Edwards had said earlier made perfect sense. "Mr. Edwards, I don't know what to say," Angela began, still reeling from the revelation. "Please sit down," Mr. Edwards said, gesturing to a chair beside his bed. "We have a lot to discuss." Over the next hour, Mr. Edwards revealed that while his stay at St. Mary's had been unplanned due to his skiing accident, it had been eye-opening. "I came here expecting nothing more than quality medical care," he explained. "But instead, I've witnessed a toxic culture of discrimination and unprofessionalism that goes against everything Healthcare United stands for." Angela listened intently, still trying to wrap her mind around everything that had happened. Mr. Edwards had seen it all: the exclusion, the microaggressions, the blatant racism. And now, with his influence, there was a real chance that things could change. "I'm in a position to do something about it," Mr. Edwards said, his tone serious. "But I need people like you, Nurse Parker, people who stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. I've seen the strength you've shown in the face of all this. You've been tested, and you've passed with flying colors." For the first time since she had started at St. Mary's, Angela felt a sense of relief and validation. Her struggles had not gone unnoticed. There was finally a glimmer of hope that the toxic environment she had been fighting against might be dismantled. As the conversation drew to a close, Mr. Edwards leaned forward. "I want to help fix this hospital, Nurse Parker, but I'm going to need your help to do it." Angela nodded, feeling the weight of his words and the responsibility that now rested on her shoulders. "I'll do whatever I can," she said, her voice filled with determination. Little did they know, this moment would mark the beginning of a transformation at St. Mary's General Hospital, one that would expose long-buried prejudices and force a long-overdue reckoning that would shake the institution to its core. "I believe that as healthcare leaders, it is our duty to ensure that the places we work in are truly inclusive and fair," Mr. Edwards continued, his tone filled with conviction. He described how he had observed both the subtle and overt discrimination Angela had endured, the microaggressions, the dismissive attitudes, and the toxic culture that seemed to pervade the hospital. "Your experience, Nurse Parker, is unfortunately not unique," Mr. Edwards said, his voice carrying a blend of frustration and resolve. "But it is absolutely unacceptable, and it ends now." As they talked, Angela felt a heavy weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time since she had started working at St. Mary's, she felt truly seen and heard. Mr. Edwards listened carefully as she recounted her experiences, his face growing more serious with each new detail. "Thank you for your honesty, Nurse Parker," Mr. Edwards said when she had finished speaking. "Your resilience in the face of such adversity is admirable, but systemic change is needed. It's time for more than individual perseverance. It's time to fix the system." Just then, there was a knock at the door. The hospital administrator, looking flustered, entered the room. "Mr. Edwards," she said, her voice shaky, "I understand there's been some concern about our hospital's practices. I assure you, we take these matters very seriously." Mr. Edwards raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" "Because from what I've seen, the only thing taken seriously here is maintaining an outdated and discriminatory status quo." The administrator visibly paled, clearly unprepared for such a direct rebuke. I'm not sure I understand. We have diversity initiatives in place." "Initiatives are not enough," Mr. Edwards interrupted, his tone sharp. "What you need is a complete overhaul of this hospital's culture, and it starts at the top." Over the next several hours, Mr. Edwards laid out his demands for systemic change. He called for a full investigation into discriminatory practices at St. Mary's, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, and a complete revamp of the hospital's hiring and promotion processes. "And as for Dr. Greaves," Mr. Edwards added, his voice firm, "I expect his behavior to be thoroughly investigated. His actions today were not only unprofessional but discriminatory and potentially dangerous to patient care." The administrator, realizing the gravity of the situation, nodded slowly. "Of course, Mr. Edwards. We will begin implementing these changes immediately." As the day wore on, word spread throughout the hospital about Mr. Edwards' true identity and the changes he was demanding. The atmosphere at St. Mary's was charged with a mix of fear, anticipation, and for some, hope. Angela, still trying to process everything that had happened, found herself suddenly at the center of attention. Colleagues who had once ignored or belittled her now approached, some offering awkward apologies, others seeking her insights about the coming changes. By the end of her shift, Angela made her way to Mr. Edwards' room one last time. She found him sitting up in bed, looking a little tired but clearly satisfied. "Nurse Parker," he greeted her warmly, "I hope you don't mind, but I've recommended you for a position on the newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Your experiences and insights will be invaluable as we work to transform St. Mary's." Angela felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, hope, and a renewed sense of purpose. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Mr. Edwards shook his head with a humble smile. "No, thank you, Nurse Parker. Your courage and professionalism in the face of adversity have been inspiring. You've reminded me why I got into healthcare in the first place, to make a difference in people's lives." As Angela left the hospital that evening, she felt that a new chapter was beginning, not just for her, but for St. Mary's as a whole. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, Angela felt genuinely hopeful about the future. Little did she know that the changes set in motion that day would have far-reaching consequences, not just for St. Mary's but for the entire healthcare industry. The story of a dedicated nurse and an unexpectedly influential patient was about to become a catalyst for change on a scale neither of them could have imagined. The following days at St. Mary's General Hospital were filled with a whirlwind of activity and emotion. The revelation of Mr. Edwards' true identity and his demands for change had sent shockwaves through the institution. The once pristine facade of the hospital had been cracked, exposing the deep-seated issues that had long festered beneath the surface. Early on Monday morning, Angela arrived at the hospital to find a media frenzy. News vans were parked outside, and reporters clamored for statements from anyone willing to speak. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, with staff huddling in small groups, whispering frantically about the changes happening around them. As Angela made her way to the nurses' station, she noticed Dr. Greaves being escorted by security toward the administration offices. Their eyes met briefly, and Angela saw a mix of anger and fear in the doctor's gaze before he was led away. "Angela!" a voice called out. She turned to see Sarah, one of the nurses who had previously been cold towards her, approaching with an awkward smile. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for how I treated you," Sarah said, her tone sincere. "I didn't realize." Angela nodded, accepting the apology, though unsure of how to respond. Before she could say anything more, an announcement echoed over the hospital's PA system. All staff members are required to attend an emergency meeting in the main auditorium in 30 minutes. Attendance is mandatory. When Angela arrived at the packed auditorium, she found a seat near the back, acutely aware of the curious glances and whispers that followed her. At the front of the room stood Mr. Edwards, now dressed in a sharp suit despite the casts on his arms. He was speaking quietly with the hospital administrator and several other officials. As the room settled, Mr. Edwards stepped up to the podium, commanding immediate attention. The whispers in the room died down to a tense silence. "Good morning," he began, his voice firm and authoritative. "For those who don't know me, I am Thomas Edwards, CEO of Healthcare United. Over the past week, I've been a patient here at St. Mary's recovering from a skiing accident. During my stay, I had the opportunity to observe the day-to-day operations and culture of this hospital." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "What I witnessed was deeply troubling. I saw a culture of discrimination, bias, and unprofessional behavior that has no place in modern healthcare." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some staff members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement. "Let me be clear," Mr. Edwards continued. "The events I witnessed, particularly the treatment of Nurse Angela Parker, are not isolated incidents. They are symptoms of a systemic problem that has been allowed to persist for far too long." Angela felt all eyes in the room turn toward her. She sat up straighter, meeting the gazes of her colleagues with quiet dignity. Mr. Edwards went on to outline the immediate changes that would be implemented: a thorough investigation into discriminatory practices, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, and a complete overhaul of the hospital's hiring and promotion processes. Furthermore, Mr. Edwards added, his voice hardening, those found to have engaged in discriminatory behavior will face serious consequences. This includes Dr. William Greaves, who has been suspended pending a full investigation into his conduct. The announcement sent another wave of whispers through the crowd. Angela could see some of Dr. Greaves' longtime supporters looking shocked and angry, while others appeared relieved. "I know these changes may be difficult for some of you," Mr. Edwards continued. "Change always is. But let me be clear, this is not just about doing the right thing morally. It's about providing the best possible care for our patients. A diverse, inclusive, and respectful workplace leads to better outcomes for everyone." As Mr. Edwards concluded his speech, he made one final announcement that sent a jolt through the room. "Lastly, I want to introduce you to the person who will be leading many of these changes," Mr. Edwards announced, his voice filled with pride. "Nurse Angela Parker has agreed to take on the role of Chief Diversity Officer at St. Mary's. Her experiences and insights will be invaluable as we work to transform this institution." Angela felt a wave of emotions, shock, pride, and nervousness, wash over her as applause filled the room. She had only discussed joining the Diversity and Inclusion Committee with Mr. Edwards, so this announcement caught her by surprise. As she made her way to the front at Mr. Edwards' gesture, she noticed the wide range of reactions on her colleagues' faces: surprise, respect, and, from some, lingering resentment. Standing at the podium, Angela took a deep breath. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards. And to all of you, I want to say this. I stand before you not as an adversary, but as a colleague who believes in the potential of St. Mary's and everyone in this room. The road ahead won't be easy, but I am committed to working with all of you to create a hospital where every staff member feels valued and every patient receives the best possible care, regardless of their background." As Angela spoke, she could see the impact of her words. Some staff members nodded in agreement, while others seemed deep in thought. Even those who had been hostile to her in the past appeared to be listening closely. After the meeting, Angela was surrounded by colleagues offering congratulations, apologies, and tentative olive branches. The atmosphere at the hospital had shifted. While there was still tension and uncertainty, there was also a palpable sense of hope and possibility. Throughout the day, Angela worked alongside Mr. Edwards and the hospital administration to begin implementing the promised changes. It was exhausting but exhilarating work, and for the first time since starting at St. Mary's, Angela felt like she was making a real difference. That evening, as she prepared to leave, Angela found Mr. Edwards waiting for her near the exit. "Nurse Parker," he greeted her with a warm smile, "or should I say Chief Diversity Officer Parker. How are you holding up?" Angela laughed softly. "It's been quite a day, Mr. Edwards. I'm still processing everything, to be honest." Mr. Edwards nodded in understanding. "I know it's a lot to take in, but I want you to know that I have full confidence in your ability to lead these changes. Your resilience and integrity in the face of adversity are exactly what St. Mary's needs right now." As they walked out of the hospital together, Mr. Edwards' expression grew more serious. "You should know that what's happening here at St. Mary's is just the beginning. I plan to implement similar changes across all Healthcare United facilities. Your story, Angela, has the potential to spark a revolution in how we approach diversity and inclusion in healthcare." Angela felt the weight of the responsibility settle on her shoulders, but instead of feeling burdened, she felt empowered. "I'm ready for the challenge, Mr. Edwards. Together, we can make real, lasting change." As they parted ways, Angela reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. From feeling isolated and on the verge of giving up, she now stood at the forefront of a movement that could transform not only St. Mary's but the entire healthcare industry. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles and resistance, but Angela felt a surge of determination. This was more than just a job, it was a calling. She was committed to ensuring that no other healthcare professional would have to endure what she had gone through. With renewed purpose, Angela set off into the evening, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The transformation of St. Mary's had begun, and with it, a new chapter in the fight for equality and inclusion in healthcare. In the months following Mr. Edwards' revelation, St. Mary's General Hospital underwent a dramatic transformation. Under Angela's leadership as Chief Diversity Officer, and with Mr. Edwards' continued support, the once toxic culture began to shift towards inclusivity and respect. The mandatory diversity and inclusion training, initially met with resistance, slowly opened minds and changed hearts. Dr. Greaves, following a thorough investigation, was dismissed from his position, sending a clear message that discriminatory behavior would no longer be tolerated. As the changes at St. Mary's gained attention, Angela became in demand as a speaker at medical conferences and diversity seminars. 1 year after Mr. Edwards' intervention, she stood before a packed auditorium at a national healthcare conference. "A year ago," Angela began, "I was a nurse on the verge of giving up. Today, I stand before you as living proof that change is possible, that one voice can make a difference." She shared the story of St. Mary's transformation, not shying away from the challenges they had faced but highlighting the victories. The lives touched, the minds changed, and the culture that had shifted. After the conference, Mr. Edwards, now fully recovered from his injuries, approached Angela with a proud smile. "Angela," he greeted her warmly, "you've come a long way from the nurse I met a year ago." They discussed the progress at St. Mary's and its ripple effects across the healthcare industry. Mr. Edwards shared that several other hospitals in the Healthcare United network had begun implementing similar programs. "You know, Angela," Mr. Edwards said, "when I checked into St. Mary's after my skiing accident, I never could have imagined the journey it would set in motion. You've not only transformed St. Mary's but reignited my own passion for this work." As Angela prepared to return to St. Mary's, she reflected on her incredible journey, from an isolated, frustrated nurse to a leader and changemaker. The work was far from over, but Angela felt a sense of hope and determination stronger than ever before. Arriving back at St. Mary's, Angela was greeted by Sarah, once a distant colleague, now a strong ally. The hospital buzzed with new energy as staff members collaborated in ways they never had before. In the main lobby, Angela paused before a newly unveiled mural depicting a diverse group of healthcare professionals working together. A plaque below read, "Diversity is our strength. Inclusion is our commitment. Compassion is our calling." Settling into her office, ready to tackle new challenges, Angela smiled. The transformation of St. Mary's was just the beginning. The real work of changing hearts, minds, and systems was ongoing, and she was ready for it all. Angela was committed to fighting for a truly inclusive healthcare system, one day at a time. What part of Angela's journey resonated with you the most? Was it her perseverance in the face of adversity or Mr. Edwards' unexpected intervention? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing to my channel. Your support helps me continue bringing you heartwarming and inspiring stories like this one. Thank you for joining me on this journey.